Okay, welcome everyone. I think we're starting now. Welcome to our, very sadly, our final Family Law Pathways Network webinar forever, really, which is very sad for us, but we're so pleased to have such a fantastic webinar to start us off. My name's Catherine. I'm from Catholic Care Victoria, and I would also like to welcome Tara and Michelle, and I will talk about our fantastic presenters in a minute. But before I do that, I would just like to acknowledge Ben, our project officer, who has done such a terrific job over the last 3 or so years in the role. We're so grateful to Ben and his commitment to the Family Law Pathways Network, and has made it really what it is today. I also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are gathering today. I'm on Wadawurrung and Dja Dja Wurrung land, and Catholic Care Victoria, which operates our Pathways Network, pays respects to and acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, waterways and community. And we acknowledge that sovereignty of lands was never ceded. So just a couple of housekeeping things before we get going on the webinar. Our presenters are very welcoming of questions, so you can either pop them in the chat or you can put them in our Q&A function, and I will help facilitate asking those questions. We may not get to them all, but we'll certainly do our best, and that will be at the end of the presentation. So I would like to introduce our presenters today. So Tara Houseman is an FDRP trainer and clinical supervisor. Her current role is practice specialist for family law services at Relationship Australia New South Wales, where she oversees practice quality and leads initiatives to drive service innovation. Her primary focus is supporting practitioners to deliver high-quality property and parenting mediation services to post-separation families through the Relationship Australia New South Wales Family Relationship Centres and Family Law Programs. Michelle Irving is a social researcher specialising in qualitative and mixed methods research. She's the Senior Research and Evaluation Officer with Relationships Australia New South Wales and PhD candidate with the Australian National University. Michelle has worked in research and evaluation roles across government, academic, private and non-profit sectors with a focus on post-separation family violence. So welcome, Michelle and Tara, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Catherine. Hi, everyone. I'm going first. I'm Michelle. And I'm, as Catherine said, the researcher with Relationships Australia New South Wales, and I'm going to be coming at this subject from the what does research tell us angle, while Tara, who is our practice expert, is going to get into the really interesting part, I think, which is the practice implications. So let's see how we go sharing these slides, Tara. Tara's in control of clicking through the slides, so hopefully we get this right. Okay, so yeah. First, so on behalf of Tara and I, we'll also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're all meeting today. I'm, for myself, on the beautiful unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people in cold, cold Canberra. I'm grateful for their continuing care of this region, which I'm fortunate to call home. Tara, where are you coming from today?
I'm coming from the Tugargal lands here in the Darug Nation, part of Western Sydney in New South Wales.
Okay. Okay, so we're talking today about couples who separate, but who for a whole range of reasons continue living together in the same house. It gets called living together apart. Sometimes I've heard it called delayed divorce. In our organisation, we're calling it separation under the same roof, or SUSR for short. I'll also note that there is a full report that we've written up on this, and you can download and have a read of that in your own time. We'll have a link to it right at the very end. So what is separation under the same roof anyway, and what isn't it? About halfway through last year, when I was asked if I could undertake a literature review on this topic, it was the first time that I had ever really heard it labelled, though it's something that I was aware was happening, and perhaps we all know someone out there who's been in this situation, and of course practitioners, you're coming across it more and more. And the decision to look into the topic, again, it actually came out of that observation from practitioners that this arrangement was coming up, it was on the rise. And we're seeing it more frequently in sessions, and it needs to be handled differently. So I went on the hunt for research. What do we know? Ultimately, though, despite looking high and low, I didn't find much. Although there's quite a bit of media interest in the subject, and I noticed even yesterday that there was an article in The Guardian on it, academic research, even just publicly available data, is pretty light on the ground. Not only is it scarce, it comes from different disciplines, it uses different methods and different definitions, and so it's a pretty mixed bag. It tells us a lot, actually made us think about how difficult it is even just to define what it means to be separated under the same roof, whether there's a minimum time that has to pass before it really counts. Do both parties have to agree that they're separated? There are some policies that to some extent answer those questions. And you can get a list of criteria if you want to change your Centrelink benefits, for example, but it's not necessarily how the rest of us might be thinking about it. And then you've got situations that are also really polarized. So on the one hand, you could have some young people who are share housing and they have a relationship for a few months, then it ends and they decide to continue living together. And on the other hand, you could have a couple that was together for 20 years, have children together, deeply entrenched lives, all their assets are shared. But in a lot of the survey data that's out there, these situations are essentially treated both as the same thing, separation under the same roof, but they're obviously completely different. And then you've got different contexts as well, like family violence, where safe choices are constrained. So there are significant additional structural and practical challenges that will come up in those situations. And all of that's a really long-winded way of saying that separation under the same roof can mean different things to different contexts and different people, and it can have different implications in light of those different contexts. There's a lot of variation and there's a lot that isn't covered in research to date. All right, but even with all that disparity, there was quite a lot of consistent findings when it came to why people are separating under the same roof, the drivers. So the two most frequently mentioned categories, unsurprisingly, perhaps are children and finances. These came up in basically every study, regardless of context. And here I've divided those drivers into those that are positive and those that are negative, which is a pretty crude way to put it. But what I'm trying to get at is that in the way that the issue was framed in research or by people participating in research, it generally indicated a difference between drivers that were proactively being chosen because a separated couple thought it would be better than the alternatives. They thought there would be advantages, and those that were occurring because there was no perceived choice, there was no viable alternative. And you can see that separated parents are leaning into children and parenting as being a reason to stay living together. And a lot of that is about wanting what's best for kids, keeping the home stable, trying to avoid distress. Sometimes it's just temporarily waiting till they're older. And there are numerous negative drivers to do with financial and economic pressures in particular, with cost of living being a big one. Obviously, it's a term that covers a lot of different factors. It's also worth noting concerns that the person who left the home would have a weaker negotiating position, both in terms of children and finances, sometimes driving these decisions. So in some cases, they're staying in the home even though they could afford to move out because of legal advice or even just their own worries about losing entitlements. And I'll just note that most of the time, these are seen as short or medium-term arrangements rather than long-term. They're transitionary. And I won't dwell too long here, but it's just to say that outside of parenting and economics, there were a lot of other complex social reasons contributing to some separated couples' decisions to live together. Though, unfortunately, these weren't explored very well and not enough for me to sort of say much more about it, just that they are sort of flagged in the research as also occurring. And while many of these are medium or even short term, there are also some that were long term, such as when an older couple chooses to continue living together because they have acknowledged that they're good company, they don't want to be lonely, or they might want to support each other through health difficulties. Okay, so in terms of outcomes, sadly, it didn't tend to be a focus of many of the analyses that I looked at, or if there was a focus, it was a bit shallow. And I know that's a real shame because I think it's probably what we'd all like to know more about. But where outcomes were mentioned in the research I looked at, they pointed to negative things like stress, increased conflict, kids witnessing conflict, challenges with space and logistics. That's things like there not being enough bedrooms to accommodate sleeping separately or separate living spaces. Boundaries in the household and domestic responsibilities becoming blurred. Who unpacks the dishwasher? How do you handle meals? And also just barriers to being able to move on to the next stage of life, whether that's with a new partner or just sort of psychologically being able to move on. And so these all sound pretty bad, but I do want to flag that I don't think there's really been much opportunity in the studies to date for positive outcomes to emerge. It does tend to be, we tend to ask questions like, what's the problem with that, rather than what's working. I didn't see any research asking things like, how much money did you save by living together for a period of time? Or despite there being challenges, do you think it did help the kids transition? Did it make it easier for your own transition? So that's a bit of a missing piece. And it'd be great to have some more research exploring those sorts of arrangements where it works, because we'd learn a lot from that, I think. So now I'm going to move on to talk about some insights that we got from our own practitioners using data that was collected from a survey midway through last year. So our FDRPs and family advisors were invited to complete a survey where they would reflect on a single recent case. Our analysis covered whose choice it was, what were the drivers, what were the challenges, as well as what were the benefits. And of course, it's important to point out that these are all clients who have sought help. And again, those for whom this sort of situation is working, they might be necessarily less likely to seek our support, or less likely to have come up in the practitioners' minds. It's also a small sample. I'm not suggesting we generalise these out to say that this is what normally happens. It's more like a nice little lovely cluster of case studies. As you see, we've got 19 responses from practitioners, and for context, the majority of these families came for both parenting and property mediation. More than 40% had been separated under the same roof for over a year, and in most cases, it's occurring under duress of some kind. So that is the category there on the left, mutual with no choice. So 11 of our cases, more than half, were described in these terms, meaning that they both agree to it, but neither of them really wants it. They just don't feel like they've got an alternative. And in some cases, it's not mutual. So for almost a quarter, one person wants it and the other doesn't. And that could be for a range of reasons, but primarily it was to do with disagreements about who moves out. And I think there was one case where one person in the relationship was hoping that it might have still been salvageable. Practitioners could also nominate multiple drivers or reasons for separation under the same roof, and unsurprisingly, most cases were said to have more than one. In keeping with the other research out there, children and financial drivers dominated. So many of the reasons given implied a short-term transitional nature of the arrangement, often pending a better financial situation or the outcome of legal matters. And even those who were in conflict about who should move out appeared to be moving towards having that matter resolved. A small number of parents spoke with practitioners about specific goals to do with children's life stages. So this was, for example, waiting until children were through high school. So that could tie them living together for a number of years, but it wasn't indefinite. Both benefits and challenges were queried in this survey as well. And again, multiple benefits and challenges were talked about for each couple. In terms of the methods, it was slightly different here. So these were short descriptive comments that were categorised into common themes that you see here. And additionally, we only had 14 responses to this question because it was only put to the FDRPs. So these numbers are out of 14, not 19. The most frequently suggested beneficiary, as you can see, thought to be children and the parenting relationship. In comments, the practitioner said that this was tied to both parents being able to spend time with kids every day and being able to provide the stability of a single residence. And in terms of the challenges, more than half were said to be experiencing conflicts and tensions because of these arrangements. And for those who had children, there was particular worries that kids would be aware of this or affected by this. Boundaries, as you can see there too, is also a big one, 8 of the 14. And in the comments, that was about who does what in the home and renegotiating those roles. So what this data says really is that there's a tension between parents wanting to put kids and parenting first, but at the same time, the realisation that it's putting strain on the family and kids can end up being placed right in the middle of this strain. On the whole, the literature review and these results highlight that although the things that drive people towards separation under the same roof might be common, what goes on after that is really quite complex, and even with good intentions and hoping for the best, it can be very hard for families to make it work. With ongoing cost of living pressures, more separated couples might find themselves either choosing or being forced into these arrangements. So it'd definitely be good to know what factors might help families to make it work, even just in the short term. And just like a typical researcher, I'll always say we just need more research. But Tara is now going to share some wisdom here, talking directly about approaches to working with separating couples and families who are living under the same roof. Over to you, Tara.
Thanks, Michelle. Like Catherine introduced earlier, I'm the practice specialist for our family law services at RA New South Wales, and my main focus is on supporting our FDR programs and the way that our practitioners look at practice and client work, and as well as supervision and training. And one of the things that really drove this research review that we completed last year was just a noticing of how many clients were coming through living under the same roof, and also noticing much longer periods of time in which they were living under the same roof. And although this work has come through our doors for many, many years, I guess it was that new factor of how many they were, what was driving them, and really wanting to try and find a way to improve how we address and respond to them. So that's what I'm hoping today we can help share how we've been navigating some of the challenges that are presented. I won't be talking about the families that are living under two separate distinct homes. So these practices that I'm talking about are all around how we respond when someone lets us know that they're living under the same roof still. And while we could see that in some cases there was a fairly amicable and effective arrangement happening, most of the families that are coming through the FRCs and family mediation are essentially living in a holding pattern with these ever-increasing levels of distress and stress, often where their kids are being exposed to their parents' conflict or tension. That could be a bit of a Cold War type environment, or it could be something more volatile and even in some cases quite unsafe. Before I dive into all of that, I want to quickly acknowledge our colleague Naomi Doyle. She's our team leader for the Penrith FRC, and she contributed a lot to the original content for today's presentation last year when we presented it at the National Mediation Conference. Always want to contribute to make sure I acknowledge those. So this diagram is sort of looking at generally in terms of the practice considerations and tensions we're finding, and not always, but this is essentially the sort of pattern we're finding. So we come in with parties coming to us, they're letting us know they have no other option, as Michelle sort of outlined, whether it was mutual agreement or one person particularly wanting it. Essentially the message is we're living under the same roof because we have to at the moment. Generally, they're needing some kind of financial settlement to try and understand their choices, their real choices. That's not to say that most of them, some of them are not in a position, even if they reach a fair and equitable financial settlement, that didn't always equate to being able to afford to live in separate homes. So it's really finding out all of the sort of getting a bit more financially literate around why they're living under the same home and what they might need to do to be able to physically separate. A lot of the parenting arrangements that they're wanting to talk about are often very theoretical, and it's very much around, I don't know how much we can really agree or negotiate until we do have a clearer picture about how far apart we live and where we live and the like. And so the impact on children and adults becomes increasingly obvious as those arrangements continue. We're looking at safety, risk considerations, often of which are connected to mediation suitability criteria. Knowing that the longer they live in this way, the more likely that distress is going to continue. But of course, if we get to a point where mediation either can't proceed or proceeds without an agreement in place, what we're hearing is clients saying that we don't really have any other legal avenue that we can afford to pursue, and we're more likely just to remain in this status quo. I'll just briefly talk about at RA New South Wales where we have families coming through, and like Michelle said, a lot of these families are wanting to resolve parenting and property disputes in mediation. And generally when that happens, we hold a guiding principle that children's issues should be prioritised and addressed first, unless there's a valid reason for discussing property issues earlier. And so where families are separated under the same roof and arrangements for children and communication between the parents is in a relatively safe holding pattern, that's kind of how we speak about it, the likelihood of parties then wanting to deal with property issues first is more common. So even when we do start talking about property arrangements and we start looking at full disclosure and outcomes, we're always continuing to check on how the children are coping when they're living under the same roof. What's happening in their living arrangements, what's happening with the tension and the post-mediation fallout if things are not going as well as they would have liked. And we might ask parents to bring back the focus on their children if we believe that needs to be prioritised. Again, always assessing suitability of mediation as cases unfold. And while many of those drivers and reasons for why families are living under the same roof can vary, many of the cases we're seeing are typically driven by necessity, but they're carrying a real emotional and relational cost to the family, and particularly children. And so, as Michelle said, they're living with very blurred boundaries, problematic communication patterns, conflict around how they interact, when they interact, particularly around shared decisions, who's paying the bills, how chores are getting sorted, generally feeling quite stuck. And those things that were tripping them up when they were in a relationship are obviously exacerbated by the separation as well, and people continue to have those problematic patterns. So right from intake, when we find out from at least the initiating party that they are living under the same roof, would like to do mediation, talk about children, talk about property. First, one of the things we've now started to do is really go in to clarify the status of the relationship. Do both parties agree that they're actually separated? It's not unusual for one person to believe the relationship's over while the other's clinging to some kind of ambiguity that might be created by living still under the same roof. And so that can be fueling conflict or misunderstanding, especially when the other person initiates a post-separation mediation invitation process. So we explore with clients who are saying we're under the same roof, we probably dive a little deeper into things like the drivers. So is this because of financial necessity? Is it a parenting choice around stability? Is it a legal strategy? So each one of these drivers is also shaping how that family is experiencing those circumstances and the living arrangements. So screening becomes even more important, particularly if they are flagging family violence, coercive control behaviour, and we might be seeing power imbalances continue to play out under the same roof. So we then need to set clearer expectations around boundaries, around timeframes, around the different expectations and the next steps in the process, and that can be helpful. There are also areas or additional areas which we would assess in these families that we may not assess to this extent if they are living in separate environments. We do inquire more into what's happening in the home environment, how decisions are being made, who's making those decisions, what are the safety concerns if someone is invited into mediation and how they might react or respond to the invitation being received, and when they go home that night. While they're at the home, we might also talk about if they are working online. There's an increase in lack of privacy and sharing of home devices and computers. We're also seeing more of a risk of monitoring of each other's communications and where people have not changed passwords to access home emails and the like. We're also asking more around how children are coping, what do they understand about the separation, have they received a story about separation, or are the parents living in that home on the premise that the children haven't yet been told that mum and dad have decided to separate. And we also do look at how the conflict or the distress or the tension might be affecting them on a day-to-day basis. Most of these families do need some legal advice a bit more often and a little bit earlier in the process, and we have been asking them to talk to their lawyers specifically about the context of living under the same roof in relation to parenting and property. And of course, we need to explore what the options might be if FDR doesn't end up proceeding, if one person doesn't agree to come, or if mediation is unsuitable, especially if parties are feeling quite trapped. So when we move on to the joint session, which we call the multi-party mediation sessions, the practice again looks a bit different. With families living under the same roof, the focus is not just on parenting agreements and property arrangements or property settlement, but it's also focused on the dynamics of cohabitation. So this means clarifying shared and private household spaces and responsibilities, who's using what spaces, when are they using them, who's doing the shopping, who's doing the cooking, who's paying what bills. And so some of these micro agreements and negotiations are becoming more and more common about trying to reduce the distress, reduce the confusion and conflict in the home, at least while they navigate the more long-term decisions around the future. So it does also mean having quite conscious conversations around timeframes, an intention. If they have an intention to separate physically, is it around the property settlement resolution, or is there some other step that needs to be taken before this can happen? And then we're finding some families are looking at this being a long-term solution, even in the aftermath of a property settlement. So trying to find what's driving that long-term solution, and practically reality testing. What will that look like? How will the conflict? How will they keep resolving that? So really getting them to find out how long-term solutions may or may not be of benefit as they hope. It also means keeping a really strong child focus. So what do the children know? How are their parents managing time with them? How are they communicating with the children about what's happening? We're often recommending parents return to mediation once physical separation has occurred, or if it's more imminent, or again, if of course the conflict flares up again, because the agreements that are reached while they're living under the same roof will often not hold under a different environment. And in the meantime, we're really focusing on communication, how they talk to each other, when they talk to each other, how they present information to the children. So all of that micro agreements become even more important when they're not living separately at the end of each day. So in the family relationship centres, as many of you know, we continue to see a high number of families where one or both parties disclose to us family violence or coercion and control. Statistically speaking, when we looked at the sort of the data, and particularly the cases that Michelle talked about earlier, we do see disclosures might appear less often, and there might be fewer AVOs and less police involvement, but that doesn't mean the risk is absent. So when family violence does present in separate under the same roof cases, it often looks a bit like this, where one party has chosen to stay under the same roof and the other party has no real choice. And so the person who has no real choice also tends to have very limited other options. We're finding a connection with people who have had years of financial, social, or emotional isolation in that relationship. And then layered over that can be things like cultural implications, migrancy implications, residency, things like that. So this is where we do see those overlaps. And we do recognise that there's a heightened risk of further violence or an increase in violence and risk at the time that someone decides to separate. The same can be about the decision to actually move out or the decision to initiate mediation. We also see those being points of heightened risk. And we do always respect the choices of victim survivors about timing, when they can safely relocate, when they can access services, and again, when they feel they are able to safely engage in mediation. So this is why we always acknowledge there are limitations to mediation. It may not be appropriate where there's current or past family violence, where the separation status is unclear, or where parties are still cohabiting despite trying to resolve these disputes. But when we do proceed, some of the things that we put into place are prioritising safety planning, assessing carefully if it's the right process at all, and doing that on an ongoing basis. There was a time when people living under the same roof was a reason to put mediation on hold until that separation either had occurred or was about to occur. Bringing property mediation into the FRCs meant that we sort of were meeting families a bit earlier where the property settlement was the reason for them to stay under the same roof. So we're just seeing that we can't, with that prevalence around these cases, it's no longer possible for us to put cases on hold. So that's kind of where practice has met need in this space. We work a lot closely with our local DV services and legal support partners, and these are families where we would be often having those people present in the process, either within the room or sort of wrapping around these families. Format is always important around whether or not we should be in the same room. Even if they are going home that night to the same house under the same roof, we may not want them to be negotiating and mediating in the same room, so they have a space to talk freely and separately from each other. Online is also where some people can be a bit tricky as to where they will be able to have a private space to mediate. So we look at that, and of course always terminating a process or delaying it when it's not safe. And we are checking agreements aren't entrenching the control patterns, and that can happen where coercion control can happen in the relationship, they remain under the same roof because that person wants them to remain under the same roof, and the agreements they reach might be just exacerbating and continuing those patterns. And I think with the changes in property law last year, particularly bringing more around the focus on the economic effect of family violence, we're very, despite the fact that someone's living under the same roof with family violence doesn't mean property issues become neutral or safe, and bringing those on the table has been something we've become very aware of. So what about the kids? Look, there can be some real positives. We do hear from families that when they are living under the same roof, kids have the familiarity of their home, their bedrooms. They get to see each of their parents every day, or have some contact with both parents. There's stability because they're staying in the same school. The commute to school is the same. The continuity with the community and their social connections remain. But those risks are quite significant if they are being exposed to ongoing conflict, where there's a lot of confusion, potentially getting caught up in loyalty binds or even part of that conflict. Older children may look at withdrawing and spending more time away from home, and younger children may be regressing in some of their behaviours. So as practitioners, we're always asking families, even though for you believe this arrangement is in the best interest of your children, does your children's experience of that actually match? And so this is where, for some of these families, child inclusive practice can be really powerful. It lets children express how they're experiencing the living arrangements, and it ensures that parents at least hear those voices. But it requires that extra level of care as well. So if children are returning home to their both parents under the same roof, we need to check that it's safe for them to participate and speak freely, and what is it that they want both their parents to hear. And we always keep driving parents back to their children's needs rather than those adult drivers such as finance or convenience that might have led to this arrangement decision. So what can we hopefully take away from this? I suppose most of the time we're looking at this being an arrangement born from necessity rather than preference. Early clarity, lots of screening, and structured agreements become more critical. Family violence, of course, heightens vigilance and a need for deeper inquiry, and sometimes FDR is not going to be appropriate at all. When joint sessions do proceed, the work is looking quite different. It's about micro-agreements and cohabitation rules and timelines. So that's a new area of practice our practitioners are becoming quite savvy around. And finally, keeping children at the centre, not incidental to these arrangements. So we do know that this arrangement can be a bridge, helping parents come or clients come from a separation decision, a breakdown in their relationship, and a bridge to where they're going to go next and what will be the next step in life. But it can also be that battleground. And so we're here to help families navigate as safe and constructively as possible. And beyond practice, like Michelle says, it's always good if there could be better research and more research, particularly around how they're experiencing separation, the positives that might be achieved from that, financial and otherwise, more longitudinal sort of studies around those families that choose to use this arrangement for more than a year, 2 years, 3 years, and how we can respond better and more effectively to these families coming through the door. So just on this last slide, we've got our contact details. We're both very happy for anyone to reach out to us. And if you wanted to grab the QR code here, this is the literature review that Michelle completed in August last year. So that's my side of it.
Thank you, Tara. Thank you so much, and Michelle. We have got a couple of questions, so I'll go to those in just a moment. But I just find, my own comment, I found it really interesting, Michelle, that literature only really seems to focus on the problems and how it's, not working so much. And often that is the case, but it would be interesting to hear from any families where it might have worked well for a short period of time. So, yeah, I thought that was very interesting. And Tara, it was really helpful to hear about how your assessments now look a bit different, and how you run your FDR sessions look a bit different, particularly around, as you said, those micro decisions and those really concrete, practical living arrangement decisions that parents now need to make that they wouldn't have otherwise had to. So I thought that was really interesting. Thank you, those comments. And sorry, just finally too, Michelle, it would be so fascinating if that any literature review or research involved children directly, like how did they find the experience of parents living under the same roof? So that was, thank you so much for that. That was so interesting. So I know there's a question in the Q&A. So this question is, it says you talk about property settlement occurring and continuing to live under the same roof long term. Can you define long term, please? Is that 12 months or many years?
I mean, I think what we're hearing from some families is it might just be until the children finish school. It could be till they go into high school. It could be a certain point or a milestone that they are waiting to occur. So even if they do have a property settlement and they've worked out what each of them will get from that, and maybe one person is going to retain the house after that, it could be a future arrangement. So we do hear a lot of connection with certain things that might happen with the kids, especially if families are separating when their children are in their late teens. So they might be waiting till that happens. But we've also had older couples who've come through where children are adult children and that's not what they're here for. So they're just negotiating their property settlement in their later part of life, and they're looking at this being more permanent. I mean, sometimes we have to bring and explore that to say, what does the current living arrangement look? What will happen if one of you does have a new relationship with someone else? How will that work? What might change the intention to live under the same roof sort of indefinitely? But that is something that we're happening with our sort of more older clients who are sort of realizing their retirement plans have been completely financially in this current climate, there might be some risk associated with, what they thought was their solid financial plan. And now separation is really carved out a lot of their savings as well.
Thanks. Yes. Thanks, Tara. Yes, there's just a question about whether the slides would be available, so we can say yes to that. So please post some more questions in the chat. I just had a couple too, Tara. So obviously, when you're assessing the suitability of mediation, the presence of family violence is a very key part of that. And there are times when mediation is not suitable due to safety and family violence. Is there any other reasons that you found mediation's not suitable for parents living under the same roof, aside from family violence and safety?
I think it might connect to whether they're coming for parenting or property. So property where they really are legally positioning themselves. So this arrangement is not a long term. It's about positioning themselves in terms of their ongoing arrangements with their children, and that's probably something a little bit new. We always heard I was told by my lawyer to stay in the home so that I had a better chance of keeping the home. But more now it's around I've been told to stay in the home so that I see my kids each day, so there's no status quo about who has more care or time before we decide to live separately. So where those families are coming and they're using that arrangement despite the distress, despite conflict, despite being quite unhealthy, that motivation can be quite tricky in terms of mediating around that. So that's just off the top of my head where I think there's a real ethical dilemma about mediating and continuing an arrangement where it's actually not in the best interest of children living under that roof. So, but then again, you're looking at what is court going to be like? What are the options available to them? If there aren't any options, how do we kind of address the safety and the advice? And that's where our legal partners and lawyers can be really helpful to give people a much better sense of why living under the same roof might actually not necessarily be a strength in terms of their future arrangements for their kids or property. Yeah.
Sure. There's a question here. Do you have any comments regarding the intersection between an intervention order, which might be called something different in New South Wales, but a family violence order, and needing to continue living under the same roof?
Yeah, that's a tricky one, isn't it? So I think it's no different than when they, I guess we call them apprehended violence orders. I think they're called IPOs or IPVs down in Victoria. They're all called different things, but they're essentially family violence orders. And where they are living under the same roof, we don't often see a no contact order. So we're less likely to see what we call a clause 6, which is do not contact except, and then allowing credited mediation might be one of the options available to them. But we're more likely just to see behavioural type AVOs. And that within the home, and more likely to see police calls or neighbours calling the police when arguments get out of hand or things like that. But it's probably the trickiest thing is where and look, we can't do mediation if an AVO prevents mediation. So even if they're living under the same roof, hopefully they don't have too many of those. It's very rare for us to have an ABO that prevents them from talking to each other if they're still living under the same roof. I think police have worked out that that's not necessarily possible. Yeah.
Mm. And I think it's far less common, but it does exist. There are family violence orders that really specify you must not commit family violence against this person, but it doesn't have, as you said, that no contact clause, or you mustn't go within 500 metres. So, yeah, occasionally in our service we might see those types of intervention orders.
We have seen them as a way for domestic violence services to help force a separation. So where someone has an ABO that says you can't come back to the house is a way for that person who was not moving out, who was creating an unsafe environment. So we have seen that, but that's typically all done before they contact our service, and they're normally not living under the same roof by that stage.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know, of course, that's also quite a high risk time for a parent if the other parent has been forced to leave because of an intervention order. Yeah. Another one here is, do you have any comments regarding the legitimacy of, this is probably for you, Michelle, of legal advice referenced in the survey results? Is there any sense of whether it is productive advice or sometimes skewed towards one party's interests, adversarial approach, and a possible red flag?
So I assume that's about where people are staying in the home because they've been advised that if they leave the home, they might lose some sort of entitlement or something along those lines. And in terms of the research, the broader research looking at that issue, it tended to come up in other jurisdictions. So it wasn't in the Australian sort of context. So I think within those jurisdictions, that was a grounded concern that they would sort of lose rights, some degree of rights to access with children or property. As to whether or not that's true of the Australian context, I reckon, Tara, you might be better off answering that question.
I'm very, very aware that some of the people watching this audience are our family lawyers and in the community providing advice. And I think, generally speaking, families who are wanting to access mediation and have got access to legal advice see the benefit of resolving things out of court and see. But I think where our clients do talk about their lawyer saying something that looks very much around just a strategy or a legal strategy to prevent, in preparation for a court process, we're not generally seeing that from our family law specialists and people who really understand that the court process is going to see that for what it is. We're more seeing that from perhaps generalist lawyers providing advice, or families coming with from some legal advice that they received more informally as part of the preparation. So I think the connection is to get them into seeing quality family law advice in response to the things and often what they believe that advice said, and having that reality checked with another voice or another piece of advice. So yes, it can be very unhelpful, but clients are often not wanting to pay too much money for lawyers. These are the clients who there's that intersection between their ability to go and find a specialist family lawyer to represent them through a process versus calling a legal advice line and getting the answer to the questions that they put. And of course, advice is only as good as the instructions provided. So there is that dilemma that we can't challenge legal advice. Sometimes we can certainly question it and we can be curious about it. We can try and connect them to quality legal services, but it is something that families do come through with what we would consider to be poor advice, and try and find ways for them to get second that from another voice or another opinion would be good.
Great, thank you. So another question. When it isn't, When it isn't suitable to continue and parties feel stuck or limited regarding next steps, they say they have called for legal advice and have been knocked back or are ineligible for legal support or are in financial distress. What are the other strategies that you consider in this space, if any, whilst they remain under the same roof?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think there's, in New South Wales in particular, there is a gap where legal services have been defunded for things like property settlement mediation and property settlement advice. And certainly there is that, that gap between people who really can access because of financially legal aid and government services versus, and they just don't have enough money for private lawyers and private advice. So they're sort of sitting in this missing middle. And we are working in the FRCs very much with that audience, where they get just enough advice sometimes, but they don't really want to invest or don't have the resources to kind of have that legal representation. Look, I think it's a really complex question that's been sort of asked around what do we do, and I think we have to recognise that when mediation is not suitable, pushing through irrespective is not safe and it's not appropriate. And so we might refer them to individually to family services, to support service, to counselling, support, just really to wrap around as much as we can as they continue to navigate that next step. And but it isn't an easy, it's an ethical dilemma, I think, where we have to terminate, but at the same time we can see that they're going to continue being stuck. And that's where I guess this practice keeps coming back to me as a supervisor as to what do we do with this case and how do we make this decision, because it's not easy, but we just know that mediation isn't the right fit for everyone and it's not safe for everyone.
Yeah, and I know not all, unfortunately, have capacity to do it, but some family relationship centres can offer legally assisted mediation, which is sort of one step beyond mediation itself. So that sometimes can help things along a little bit. But yeah, as I said, not all FRCs or all mediation services are able to offer that for various reasons.
And a lot of our community legal partners who do our parenting under the same roof type mediations, we do have that option there, are not funded to do property and financial mediation. Sure. And so you kind of, they also struggle with when the conversation moves into financial, can they stay in the process or do they need to leave the process because of their own contractual obligations and limitations in their funding. So that is definitely something we're calling out and very aware as legal aid loses some of its funding.
Yes, definitely a gap there still, I believe. I think that brings us to the end of the questions. I'll just check the Q&A, but that seems to be all of our questions at this point. So thank you both so much for presenting that. It's definitely such a topical issue and one that many practitioners, both legal and mediators, community professionals would be dealing with. So we really appreciate the insight that you've provided. And we did let Michelle and Tara know that they would be our very final presenters for Family Law Pathways, and really appreciate that on our second last day we were able to do this with you both. And again, just testament to such high quality webinars and PD that we offer to have Michelle and Tara here with us today. As I've said, I would like to just again acknowledge Ben, our project officer. Many of you would have received newsletters from him, emails, links to webinars, slides, etc. He's done such a terrific job in Pathways, and Catholic Care are very grateful for all of his work. I hope that all of you somehow will stay connected in this sector. It's such an important one for families. So thank you, everyone. And yes, we will certainly provide the recording and the slides to you all. So thank you for being with us. Thank you to our steering committee too at Greater Melbourne, and we hope you have a great afternoon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Michelle and Tara. Lots of thank yous there in the chat for you.
That's
great
lovely.
webinar, yeah. So thank you both. We really appreciate your time with Ben and I and the big group today, and thank you for being generous with your slides and your recording as well.
No, it's great. I was well timed. I think we booked this before we knew about the funding, and so it was.
Yes, we did. So yes, thank you. I'm sorry, no pressure, but you were the last. But we've certainly had some great feedback. So yeah, thank you both, and hopefully somewhere or another we'll be in contact again.
Thanks.
All right. Well, thanks, Ben. I think you can end. I know people are slowly dropping off.